Welcome to another edition of Transformational Astrology. I'm Henry Seltzer, and Transformational Astrology is a great name for what we've got going. With this full moon that's coming up with a great emphasis on Pluto, which is the transformational agent of the outer planets. So without further ado, let's switch to the chart and start talking about the chart. And we'll also take questions later on after we talk about the chart for a little bit. And so here we go. Bringing up the chart now. And this is the chart for the full moon coming up on the 19th, which is Tuesday morning, early on the west coast, 10:54 a.m. on the east coast, and then in the afternoon for Europe. And what we want to see with this full moon, probably the very first thing we want to see, is that the sun and the moon are again at the very beginning points of their signs. The sun is at 0 degrees of Pisces. I'll move the mouse over that away. And right there in Pisces also is Neptune, the ruler of Pisces, and by George there's Mercury less than a degree away, which is the ruler of Virgo. So we have the ruler of Pisces conjunct the ruler of Virgo, as we have the sun in Pisces opposite the moon in Virgo at the very beginning of the sign. So I think it's quite interesting to think about that in terms of the Pisces-Virgo axis, we call it. It is a profound axis. It's related to the 12th and the 6th house in the natal chart. And basically it is what is right here and now and being in service to what is right here and now, which is Virgo, which is the 6th house also. And then what is beyond the physical, as represented by the 12th house, Pisces, and Neptune. So we have that contrast going on here, and it's quite interesting to think about that because really it is what we have. I don't know how many people know anything about the Kabbalah, but it's quite interesting to think about the variance between all the parts of the tree of life called the Kabbalah, where we have the physical plane represented at the base of the whole structure, the Sephirah that is at the very bottom. And then all the other Sephirah relate to higher planes of reality. And we circulate, the reason I'm bringing it up is we circulate between the physical plane and the beyond plane all the time. So as Sting once put it, we are spirits in the material world. We are here only in transient and temporarily and for earth lessons, and at the same time we dwell in the beyond, as many of the spiritual traditions have indicated. And we go back and forth between those points of view constantly. So the great trick of this earth existence is to bring ourselves further into spirit as we do our everyday activities and reside in the physical. We don't want to neglect the physical. We don't want to get so spiritual that we don't have a foothold in the earth. We want to acknowledge the fact that we have bodies, physical bodies. They need to be fed. We need to feed ourselves and try to do that in a conscious way, and try to do that in a way that's nutritious and nourishing and not junk food. Similarly with our minds and our egos, we have to feed them as well. We have to acknowledge the fact that we have an ego, that we have a position amongst our fellow beings on this planet of both competition and cooperation constantly. And while we're doing all these things, we're really dwelling in our understanding of what is beyond the physical. And they were very clear about this in the Middle Ages when they had the great chain of being and they had the understanding of the institution, the great institution of the Christian religion at the time in Europe, and of other religious traditions in other parts of the world, of course, Buddhism, Hinduism, I don't want to leave anything out, Muslim, but basically those things are all connected in a way that no longer was quite as appropriate in the Western understanding that we've come to of linear thinking, scientific evidence, cause and effect, being able to do the material world in such great and fine detail so that we can, medical advances have been incredible. We've conquered outer space. We've sent, missions out to outer space to see what the planets really look like up close. All the things that we've done, bring us closer and closer to a very thorough understanding of the physical world that does not, however, give us the understanding of the beyond that we used to have and used to take on faith, because now we have so much science that tells us all these physical things. And yet, as we're beginning to understand as astrology helps to demonstrate, we are living in a very mystical and mysterious universe where things happen from a whole different perspective that may have not so much cause and effect as it's a simultaneous occurrence, which Jung called synchronicity. He had a name for it, and he had a process of investigating psychological behavior and the content of our psyches based on what he saw as a different way of being in the world, not just simply one event causes another, but we have the very complex event of a human life and a human consciousness, which is very equivalent to an angelic consciousness, really, a God consciousness. We're all God within. And so that understanding is beginning to permeate the culture, and we're seeing the great change to the 21st century, when maybe the age of Aquarius is dawning as well, when we begin to realize we are living in a different reality, and we begin to act as though what we did mattered. We have a moral compass that actually allows us to govern our actions based on a spiritual understanding of who we are beyond the physical, beyond greed, beyond materialism, beyond getting the most toys before you die, as people sometimes say. So this is where we are at, and so that's why, bringing it back to the chart, this is why this Pisces Virgo axis that we're seeing activated here, both with the Sun and Moon in opposition and with Neptune and Mercury in conjunction in the 12th house of the chart, 12th natural house represented by the sign of Pisces, it really brings all this really poignantly to our awareness, and we may feel a little more spacey, is another way to put it, with Neptune so prominent, and with our mental facility, or faculty rather, that ordinarily interprets things on a very logical basis, that is colored by the Neptunian consciousness of what is beyond everything, so that we really have an opportunity. We can seize the moment to try to make a difference based on what we believe at the deepest possible level. And I've talked about Eris quite a bit. I think many of you who have tuned in before to what I'm trying to say know that Eris, which is sitting at 23 degrees of Aries, is very close to being exact square with Pluto now, and that's through all the way up through 2020. So I think the Pluto-Eris square is quite important, and the Pluto-Uranus conjunction is still active as well. So what we have is we have the Uranus-Pluto square, which is the key aspect of this entire decade, indicating great social change, as was initiated at the Uranus-Pluto conjunction of the 1960s, which was when a lot of ideas along the lines that I've just been describing came into being, but they weren't really part of the mainstream. And now the question is, can we make it part of our mainstream culture to go with this principle of higher understanding, of a more spiritual way of looking at things, and yet still keep our grounding in the physical, which is what is required if we're going to make things happen in this way. So it's a pretty big thing that's happening, and the whole culture is shifting. The society is shifting, and we're seeing the evidence of that in the chaos that surrounds us right now, and some of the extreme behaviors that we're seeing, some of the polarities that we're seeing, and some of the consciousness around global changes in the earth that we're seeing greater and greater recognition of, but being resisted in some quarters by people that really feel like we can't spend time on that. We have to be busy making money and taking care of things right here at hand and not worry about what's going to happen in a few years down the line, which is rather short-sighted. It doesn't go along with the Native American notion of 7 generations. Think about what things are going to be for the next 7 generations. So those are the issues that face us, and I think they're very much revealed in the astrological symbolism as we see it, because right now I've been talking about this, Saturn and Pluto getting closer and closer to a complete parallel with each other. Right now we have Saturn, the declination is 21.9, that's a degree off of the celestial equator, where we have it in 3 dimensions as well as just around the ecliptic, which is represented in the flat chart. And if we look at Pluto, the declination is 21.8. So there again, 21.9 and 21.8, getting really close. And meanwhile, also Jupiter makes a parallel too. You can see the parallels listed here. Parallel to Saturn, parallel to Pluto being 22.5, which is about 0.6 of a degree further. In other words, less than a degree. A degree is considered a parallel between these items. So we have Jupiter, we have Saturn, we have Pluto. These 3 are coming together. Jupiter is catching up to Saturn, catching up to Pluto. There will be a triple conjunction in late 2020, which a lot of astrologers are looking at as, hey, this is a big watershed moment in the whole culture. Whenever we see Jupiter and Saturn together, and they're coming together shortly after that, by December 21st of 2020, they're coming together at the very 0 degree point of Aquarius, suggesting societal change, societal awareness. Is the whole culture shifting in a certain way? And we astrologers, most of us believe that it is. And then we really have only a couple of years here to really make a difference and to see what that change coming along in 2020, what that actually portends. And then incidentally, how interesting that it's November 2020, mid-November, when we see the Jupiter, the Saturn, and the Pluto aligned in the sky in Capricorn, square to Eris in Aries. And we also see at the same time that there's this big election happening in the United States, which is in some ways a battle over some of these same issues. How are we going to resolve that? How are we going to make everybody happy? How are we going to be able to bring the society forward in a way that everybody agrees with? Things that have to be done, things that are demonstrably necessary to be done, including addressing income inequality for that matter, and including addressing the imbalance in the way the earth is being handled right now, and we have to protect the earth. And the earth will react, whether we protect the earth or not. The sea levels will rise drastically if we don't do something about global warming. So there you have it. That's the basis of what we have going, and it's really reflected in all these new moon and full moon configurations. It's quite fascinating. I mean, we have also, as I've been talking about, Eris and Uranus are 6 degrees apart right now. So if you take the average, it's 26 degrees right in between, and 26 degrees of Libra right across the zodiac. We have Haumea, and Haumea is one of these new planets that is very little really known, but I've been able to do a bunch of research on this planet and also Maki Maki, and they are really Earth-oriented planets, Earth activism in the case more of Maki Maki, and Earth appreciation and a protean flexibility of understanding what the spiritual path connected with nature is. And so these are very activated right now. In fact, we have Maki Maki in aspect to Mars. Mars has just entered into just entered into Taurus, rather. And we have that in an inconjunct relationship, as well as having this inconjunct that Maki Maki also makes to the Sun degree, which is 0 degrees of Pisces. These guys are in sextile, the Sun and Mars, and that sextile goes to a point which ideally would be a little earlier in Libra, but it's still within orb to say that Maki Maki is the focal point of a yod between the Sun and Mars, and to see that also Haumea is the opposition point of this very tight conjunction between the midpoint of Eris and Uranus is also directly opposite to Haumea. So these new planets are all very prominent in the skies right now, and they refer to both Earth issues and to taking an individual stand, which is the feminine warrior energy of Eris. Everybody needs to stand up and be counted, stand up and vote for one thing in the election that's coming, but stand up and be counted. And what do you really believe? And if you can articulate that, and if you can take action in concert with that, you are no longer subject to the situation as though you were powerless, but you have that power within yourself to take that action that you feel is the right action, and that empowers you. It's not a question of it's beyond our control. It's actually very much within our control. when you speak of, by saying within our control, when you speak of the entire population of this nation or of the planet, acting in concert can obviously make a huge difference. The thing is, we have to get it together. So that's the real message of these days, these times, is can we get it together? A couple of other details I do want to mention. It's quite interesting to me that Venus lies between Saturn and Pluto and therefore kind of brings them together. Venus is the ruler of Libra, where we find Haumea, this prominent Haumea, so bringing us together in the way that Pluto and Saturn represent massive transformation. Venus, therefore, lying between them and bringing them together represents a transformation that may affect our understanding of relationship with each other. It does mean that personal relationships are under some strain right now because there's obviously Venus is going to move closer to Pluto, and there is a great deal of transformation of relationships that's happening as well right now. But the interesting thing is also that by Venus pulling together Saturn and Pluto, we have this sense of structure of the society that's changing. Structure of the society indicated by Capricorn, indicated by Saturn and Capricorn, and then having that Saturn coming together with Pluto and also with Jupiter coming along, the structure of the society is what's changing. And the fact that Venus is right in between in this particular full moon configuration means it's very much on everybody's minds and in our hearts. That midpoint of Venus and Pluto is 20 degrees, right in between 18 and 22, 20 degrees of Capricorn, making an angle called the semi-sextile, a 30-degree angle to Jupiter. So, and Jupiter, in a way, is in a grand trine when you consider also the fact that Jupiter at 20 degrees, Eris at 23 degrees, and then the moon to some extent, which is just leaving the last degrees of Leo. So you have, to some extent, a grand trine, even though it's out of sign as far as the moon is concerned. In fire, which means activity, which means getting everything together, starting to really make changes. So it's a very big month. In regard to that, we saw it in the new moon also. It's a very big spring, and this is a big year of 2019, which is a transition year to 2020, which is very powerful for the society at large. So the sky is telling us things, we can pay attention, and maybe we can learn how to do a little bit better job of inhabiting this planet. So that's part of what we want to say, and then do we have questions that came in?
We do have questions.
And this is Leslie, who's here with me today, and she's going to be helping us with the questions.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in with us today, and thank you for all of your questions. I just want to give a gentle reminder that we ask you frame your questions in a way where the information in the answer can be relevant to everyone. So try to keep your questions sort of in the general topics of astrology rather than really, really specific to your own chart or horoscope.
Makes sense.
Jumping into our questions, let's take the first one from Navia. She asks, can the moon affect energy levels in our bodies like exhaustion? I know we are mostly water, so it affects us, but can it wear us out?
Well, yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the moon does relate to the body. The moon relates to the child within as well. And the moon relates obviously to motherhood, which is where we get our being in the amniotic fluid of the mother's womb. So yes, the moon's fluctuations do represent fluctuations in emotions, fluctuations in the field that we have. I think exhaustion would be more of a feeling perhaps than, there's exhaustion that comes because you've just been having to really slog too hard and you need to take a break. And there is emotional exhaustion as well, which can be as a result of attitude, as a result of how you take things, how you interpret what's happening. Is it a difficult thing? Is it an impossible thing? Or is it something you can rise above and surmount? And it has a lot to do at that point with optimism and attitude and belief in the universe to be your guide. I always like to say to people that are feeling bad and feeling like, oh my God, what am I going to do? How am I going to deal with this? I always like to say, well, you're not the only one driving the bus. There is the universe on your side, helping. And if you look at it as a trial, as a test, I've gone through these things because I somehow chose this, and I somehow am learning from it, and I'm learning, my character builds or whatever. That's how I think astrology can really help when you see things in that cosmic perspective. So that's a kind of a tangential answer.
Great, thank you. The next question is also about the moon from Marty. Can you please, just kidding, not Marty, from Athena, asking, what are the best ways to work with these rare and unique full moon and planets' energies to be in better attunement with their offerings?
Well, that's a great question. I think that's a great question. And, really, what we can do is we can honor these times. We can reflect on where we are, where we're going, what we're up to, taking a more cosmic perspective, which I try to stress in these interpretations that I give of what's happening for the culture as reflected in the configurations of the new moons and the full moons and the quarter moons, too. For the quarter moon is a very delicate time when there's a lot of conflict in when the beginning of quarter moon, the first quarter moon, can the beginning impulse of the new moon really be successfully translated into action that makes sense, that works, or do we succumb to the difficulties of the situation? That's when that stressor of the moon and the sun and moon in square with each other comes into play. So they're different times. You honor the new moon in one way, the full moon in another, perhaps. The new moon is a great time to really meditate on what you're up to. And if we just remember that we're in tune with cosmic process, of course we can really benefit from remembering that at any time, right? But in particular, when we honor the new moon, the full moon, the solstices, the equinoxes, the eclipses, we're really recognizing our kin with natural process and with something beyond ourselves, bigger than ourselves, bigger than even the social matrix that we have here. Recognizing that there are cosmic forces at work, I think is very, very important. And what we need, what the prescription is for having a more spiritual, one way to look at having there are many ways to spirit, but one way to look at having a much more spiritual approach to our lives. So good to honor them. I think just honoring them, making ritual, taking time, taking time away from the schedules and the screens and the challenges, and just sitting in peace and reflecting. It's very important.
Thank you.
Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
Okay. See, I'm getting there.
Our next question is from Marissa, asking, is Capricorn amplified when it's both the sun and moon placement in a birth chart?
I think you're asking if the sun and moon in Capricorn in a birth chart, which is either a new moon or an old moon, about to be a new moon, if that means that Capricorn is emphasized. Of course it is. That's simple answer is yes.
Would you like to say anything else about it or no?
Read the question again and I'll see if I can find something else.
Is Capricorn amplified when it's both the sun and moon placement?
We're talking about natal chart.
Yes, we are.
So the question is, if I'm a double Capricorn and I have the sun in Capricorn, I have the moon in Capricorn, and then the question would be also, is it a new moon placement, which is the moon slightly ahead of the sun, or is it an old moon placement, which is called the balsamic moon, where the moon is about to become a new moon? And those are two different personality types. The new moon personality type is very go-getter, like Aries, never wants to ask anybody's advice about anything, just make it happen. And the old moon position, the balsamic moon, is actually a different phase where even though the sun and moon are both in the same sign, they have this interesting thing that it's before the new moon. It's the last phase of the old moon. And those people like to share their wisdom. They like to shed light and help other people to get to where they need to get to. So they're old souls, typically. But yeah, sure, Capricorn is obviously a strong emphasis in that chart.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
The next question we'll take is from Teresa, asking, can you explain what it means to have retrograde planets in your birth chart and what kind of effects they can have, positive or negative? For example, Saturn in Scorpio, or Rahu in Libra and Ketu in Aries, which you might want to explain a little bit.
Okay, those are interesting examples, because Rahu and Ketu,
which are the South Node and North Node, for those who haven't heard them called that.
right, which I was going to say, there's the South Node and North Node. But anyway, those are Vedic terminology for those. And they generally move backwards. The nodes move backwards through the signs, which is why, it's just the way they work. The true node moves forward and backward, but it trends backward, and the average node always moves backward, because that's the average motion of the nodal axis. So they're always in retrograde. So it's not a question of, now they can be, actually the true node can be sometimes retrograde, sometimes direct, but I don't really think that makes much of a difference in the way we experience them when they're in a natal chart. I believe that the sign position of the nodal axis is important, and the aspects it makes to planets, but not the fact that they might be by chance movement of the way the nodal axis works, slightly moving ahead, then going back to there, trending backwards. Now, that's similar to the outer planets, actually, to tell you the truth, my impression. In other words, if Saturn is retrograde, it's not that different from Saturn direct, although it is more inner. They say that retrograde planets operate on a more internal level. You might be a more thoughtful person with your Saturn placement, but still the most important thing about your Saturn placement is the aspects that it makes to other planets, where it's located house-wise, the house that it's located in your natal chart. Those are really strongly important compared to the fact that it might be a little bit of a extra nuance that Saturn happens to be retrograde in your chart. Now, that's not true of the inner planets. The inner planets, Mercury, Venus, and Neptune, if those, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, if those are retrograde, that does make a difference. They operate on a more internal level. Retrograde Venus, you might be more inner than outwardly relating. Retrograde Mars, you may have a tendency to hold back from action and be more introspective. Same with Mercury, of course, that we say when Mercury is retrograde in the sky, during the Mercury retrograde period, it's an introspective time, a time of deep reflection. And that's the best way to honor those planetary symbols of personal planets in retrograde, is to reflect on that aspect of them and to honor that as you think about them.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Next question comes from Catherine. Hello, Henry. What does it mean if you don't have planets in all of the houses?
Well, that's typical. Typically the planets are not in all the houses. They would be really spread out thinly throughout the chart, which is, an indication of a very well-rounded and general person that's kind of all over the place and can be expert in many areas, can have many different facets to their personality. Concentrated planets, like if they're within a third of the chart or something like that, those are very focused personalities. They seem to have a real predilection for certain activities that are the ones that they specialize in, and they may have gaps, things that they don't specialize in. But generally speaking, a sign or two, or house or 2 or 3 or 4 that don't have planets in them, it's very typical and very ordinary in a chart. You might want to look to the ruler of that house. Like in this particular chart, if we thought of it as a birth chart, you can see that, for example, the 3rd house is empty, and that's got Gemini on the beginning of that, on the cusp of that house. And so then we would look to the position of Mercury and see, well, what is there about this person's communicative abilities or skills or predilections might we glean from the fact that, hey, Mercury is exactly conjunct Neptune. So this is a kind of a spacey communicator. This is somebody that thinks in a way that has to do with beyond as much as right here and now. They may change topics surprisingly, or they may be lost in their own vision and illusion at times. And the fact that also there's the square to Jupiter, you'd want to consider that when you're looking at this as a birth chart. So, that's the way you would deal with empty houses. So it's not an unusual thing.
Thank you. Next question is from Jill. How do we find out more about the new planets that you were mentioning?
Oh, great. Great question. I do have an article coming out in the Mountain Astrologer. I can't tell you the month yet, but that article references all three of these. You know that I wrote the book about Eris. I have a really good book, actually, called The 10th Planet, which is available from Amazon, and it deals specifically with Eris and only with Eris. But then the fact that Eris was named a dwarf planet in 2006 by the International Astronomical Union, along with these other two planets of Makemake and Haumea, those are the three besides Pluto that were named as dwarf planets in the Kuiper Belt, and they are the four largest bodies in the Kuiper Belt. So they are really the four significant bodies of this collection of items. And one way to think of it is the way you think of major asteroids. The four first discovered asteroids are also the largest in the asteroid belt. And they do have significance in charts. The four major asteroids are considered feminine archetypes, and there's books about them. So I'm firmly of the belief that these new, I call them planets, they are perhaps in a little bit more minor planet category than the major outer planets of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, although Pluto is in that same category of dwarf planet. So you could consider them all planets of a certain ilk, and I think these other two, with Haumea and Makemake, being earth energy. Haumea is the earth goddess. She was the creation goddess of the Hawaiian culture, and she changed her body and produced births. All the pantheon of Hawaiian goddesses and gods were created from her body by giving birth from all different parts of her body and then regenerating as a young woman. And she was also responsible for the flora and fauna of the Hawaiian Islands and the food that was present everywhere. So it's very protean. From the mythology, it's a very protean, flexible connection to spirit through nature. And you find these people are very involved in nature. They're animal lovers. They have a certain spiritual presence that's really quite fascinating if they have a strong Haumea. And Makemake, I think, is very, very similar. It's also earth-oriented. They have about the same period, about 300 years that takes to go around, a little bit longer than Pluto. And Makemake, I believe, is the more activist of the two, and Makemake was, in mythology, was the creation god of the Rapa Nui culture. So these are fascinating. There's an article I've written. I've given talks about it. You might find there is. I don't know how you can get the video anymore, but just recently there was a very nice 2020 summit, 2020 triple conjunction series of talks that were collected by Daniel Gimario, who is a shamanic astrologer, and he also is very interested in these new ones, and in particular Eris. He's very fascinated with Eris. And he has, he included me in that summit, and there was a talk that I gave there where I tried to delineate mostly about Eris, I think, actually, in that one. And then for Astrology Hub, I talked about these new ones. So there's been lectures here and there. And I am coming out with this article in Mountain Astrologer. Eventually there'll be a book. I've been asked to be part of an American ephemeris of trans-Neptunian planets, including these four, Pluto, Eris, Haumea, and Makemake. And that'll be coming out this year, during this year at some point. So I can't give you too many details on publication dates as yet. Still in process there.
Awesome, thank you. I wanted to let everyone know that I've included links to information on Eris and your book, as well as the Eris report in the comments here, if anyone's interested in that.
Yeah, the publications about Eris are much more available at this point, but it won't be long before I'll have more publications on these other two.
Exciting stuff.
It's pretty exciting, isn't it?
Ready for the next question?
Sure.
It's from Duran. Any opinions on Aries' movement into Chiron?
Well, yes, definitely. You mean Chiron's movement into Aries. I did
yeah.
I did intend to say something about that. I mean, it's interesting that Chiron in this. Good that we still have the chart up. This full moon configuration, where Chiron has just moved into Aries, so it's this ingress, and it moves back and forth across the Aries Pisces borderline quite a bit. So it's not out of the woods yet, which you can tell in the time passages software. I'll give you a little show of that by right-clicking on the Chiron glyph. The next station is July 8th. So then we'd want to go ahead and go past that point. So I'm going to animate the chart and go past that point to the point where it's retrograde. And this is by looking at August. So then we'll right-click again on it, and then we find, oh, it goes back to 1 degree of Aries. So I guess it is in there for good. Now, it was going back and forth. So that's, let's see, we want to revert. So here we're back to the full moon chart. So I was wrong about the fact that it's going to continue to do that, but it has been going back and forth between Pisces and Aries. So now it's in Aries for good, and it does mean that there's a more prominent Chiron, and you can see that in a couple of ways. One is right now in this full moon configuration, because the sun and moon are at 0 degrees of their signs, they do make an angle, an inconjunct and a semi-sextile to this Chiron. So Chiron is kind of prominent, actually, and we'll check and see if there's parallels as well. It is parallel also right now to Eris. How interesting. So that is interesting. I didn't know that. It's kind of widely parallel. So the fact that Chiron is emphasized in this full moon, I think, is important. There is a certain amount of angst associated with the current social situation that we have, and I think there's transformation implied right now for everybody in the society. I mean, we all have to deal with what's coming down, and it means personal transformation. And it's good. It means that we can actually change in the ways that we really are intended to change. That's life. You know, life itself is change. And if we stop changing or we try to resist change, we're actually resisting living. So what I'd like to say about that is that does create a certain amount of fear. And also there's the normal Chiron manifestations, which does refer back to old wounding, which is another thing you really want to get past, right? It inhibits you. If you have a knee-jerk reaction to authority because authority was not something that was pleasant in your youth, that gets in your way, you know, so it's good to recognize those things and to try to get beyond it. So at any time it's good to tune into the inner wounding, but this is a particularly strong time to be able to do that because it's a very thoughtful time, a time when we're tuning into cosmic realities. And part of that cosmic reality is that we can get past our early wounding and really become more fully ourselves if we do the work. So that is one thing that Chiron is all about, and it is featured now, and I think because of the movement into Aries, it is also a little bit more up in our consciousness. There's more possibility for action on the basis of recognizing where we're wounded and how we can deal with that going into the future. So it's a good time to tune into Chiron. Very good time. Losing my voice. So we have another question?
We do. We have quite a few more.
Quite a few more? Well, we can't take too many. We can only take, we can take a few more.
Okay. Let me know when you're ready to stop.
Okay.
Next question is from Adrian. Is there any specific meaning when a full moon like this occurs on a royal star, in this case, Regulus?
I haven't looked into that, so I'm not going to say anything about that.
Okay. The next question is from Ellie. Is it correct to surmise that when you have several planetary returns in a short period of time and well aspected, that it is generally a propitious time for action?
I would say so, yes. Planetary returns, to mention what that is, just like we have a solar return every year on our birthday, when the sun returns to its original position, and we would want to do the solar return chart for that, which is exactly when, it might be the day before your birthday, exactly when the sun reaches the degree, minute, and second that it was occupying when you were born. So that's a solar return, very indicative of the entire year you're about to have from birthday to birthday. It's a very powerful technique. Just as you can do that, you can do any other planetary return as well. And then that's bringing that planet into greater awareness for you, because that same planet is in the sky conjunct the natal position. So brings, your Venus return brings Venus more into your life, your understanding of what Venus represents for you. It's a good time to meditate on that. And just the events come along, and they do represent a repeat, a similar, a connection with what is up for you with relationship, what is up for you with your mental process, if it's Mercury return, which happens as well about once a year. So if you have a bunch of those, yeah, I think it's a very good time to not only to take action, but to look into who the heck you are, to try to figure that out, which is part of taking action, because taking the right action depends on understanding yourself and understanding what you're up to and where you're going. So yes, the answer is yes.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Jerry. How does a conjunction of the moon with Saturn, Venus, and Pluto translate?
Say that again.
How does a conjunction of the moon with Saturn, Venus, and Pluto translate?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So, well, in the current skies, we do have Saturn, Venus, and Pluto together. The moon isn't there yet, but it will be before the next new moon. So, in the next couple of weeks, that will be happening. See, we could say exactly. In the time passages software, you can actually do this. We can do day by day. So maybe I'll do that just to show you some of the features of the software. So you can see every day the moon moves about, 2.5 days for each sign. And then by the time it gets up to kind of close, this is where it hits the south node. It's spread between them. It's almost to Venus, and it's in the same sign as Saturn and Pluto. So this is kind of what you're talking about, which turns out to be in the beginning of March. So then the moon just, all the moon does is it brings it to our emotional awareness. It makes it more prominent. So the basics of the situation is the Pluto, Saturn, Venus. That's what's really going on. And that's really revealed in this full moon configuration, because they're right, Venus is right in the middle between them. So, I think that I just alluded to it when I was talking earlier, that Venus does govern relationships. And with Saturn there's limitations on relationships. And with Pluto there's transformation in relationships. So you may very well find in your personal relationships a couple things. One is that you're challenged for commitment. The idea of Saturn with Venus is definitely involved with commitment. And that can be a game changer. It can be, oh my God, I can't do this commitment and something has to give. Or it can be, yes, I can step up to this, I want this commitment. And in any case, it changes you, and it changes your relationship to recognize those factors. You could say also with Pluto and Saturn that the structure of the relationship could be changing. Maybe, for whatever logistical reasons, there has to be a change of locale for one of the partners, so there's a different relationship because there's a commute involved. Or the opposite, somebody decides to move closer, or they change, the housing situation changes, or the relationship changes the way it's structured. That you may have an understanding that changes with each other that makes a huge difference in the way you relate to each other. There's many different ways to look at what could be a structural change in a relationship, but those could all be factors in this triple conjunction that we're seeing right now in the sky. So I guess I'll leave it at that.
Cool. 2 more questions?
Yeah, definitely.
Great. Missy asks, can you please explain what the ascendant, rising, moon, and Venus signs signify?
Well, that's an interesting... everybody knows that the rising sign is the third important sign, right? The sun and moon and rising are the 3 signs that we usually give when we talk to somebody about themselves. And the rising sign is very interesting because it's both what you see and what you get. I mean, it's an indication of what you see is what you get. It's your appearance. So they say that somebody with a Cancer rising has got a kind of a round face like the moon. Somebody with Leo rising might have a lot of hair, like a mane of hair. So it's and of course Leo rising people are more present. They tend to be more dramatic and they're showing themselves more. Cancer rising people are a little bit more secretive, but they have more emotional availability. You always know where you stand with a Cancer rising person. You can see their emotions. They wear their heart on their sleeve, so to speak. And the funny thing is that the ascendant also represents where you're headed spiritually. It's really kind of a glimpse of your deeper personality, what your real personality is, where you're growing toward. So how can it be both the way you look and who you really are under the surface, right? And I think the answer is that there's a lot of interconnections between how we present and who we are when you just see somebody, when you just see their face for the first time, or when you see them speaking, and who they really are. There's a way that those vibrations come through, and I think it's quite interesting that we can see that just from the philosophical understanding that we have of what the ascendant really represents, is both surfacey and also deep understanding of maybe a more spiritual depth to the person, that where they're headed in their life, maybe what their soul mission is, can kind of come through the ascendant. So that's very interesting. As far as what would the Venus sign mean, that is really a lot about how you relate. Venus in Gemini likes to talk. Venus in Cancer is more emotional than Venus in Aquarius, which is more, like a little more abstract and distant, unemotional, you might say, but there's a deep emotion there, but it's just not reflected in the surface behavior. So it's how you relate to people more. That's the Venus. And also, it could be art, it could be values in art. Those are Venus qualities as well. So that summarizes that, I think.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
Okay, I've saved this question for the last,
Uh-oh.
as it may take us down a path that some people may wish to excuse themselves for. But it's from Marty. Can you please look at the USA chart for this full moon? I know a lot of people don't like getting political, but ... as above, so below.
Well, I knew this question was coming up because Leslie alerted me at the very beginning. She said, there's a question about the USA chart. Do you want to do it? And I said, okay. So we'll just display transits. And then we can see, we want to do like a day further. So here's roughly the transit. The moon is a little bit out of alignment. The moon should be at 0. Here's the sun at 0. Well, guess what? This full moon aligns with the moon in the USA chart, and that represents the public. So we have a lot of public changes, transformations that are happening. The public is getting involved in this whole political situation that we have in the United States, I believe. And I don't want to get too political either, to tell you the truth. One thing that's happening right now also is Uranus being in square with the natal Pluto, which is at 27 degrees of Capricorn. And of course, Pluto is generally speaking going to make that Pluto return. It's not happening yet. It won't even be happening at the end of 2020 when we do see that conjunction between Saturn, Jupiter, and Pluto is going to still be only at around 23 or 24 degrees. So it's not quite at the Pluto return. And I forget when that timing is. I think it's 2022 or something. But that might be another indication. We talked about planetary returns a minute ago. Here's the Pluto return of the United States. It's a 248-year transit. And, that could indicate a big change, especially because it's in the second house. It could indicate a big change regarding the economic circumstances of the country, regarding the way the plutocracy of the country is oriented. Those things could be lurking in the next few years. But to answer the question more specifically, this particular full moon doesn't hit so strong. I mean, I think if we go back a couple weeks, and we look at the 4th, which is when the new moon happened. Oops. So sometime around here, And yeah, the thing about this is quite interesting is it's trine. This new moon of February 4th was trine the Saturn, which is the executive. So, I mean, this whole February month has been a lot of stuff, I think, about the president, about the shutdown, the famous shutdown, about the famous border wall that the president wants and is insisting on getting. And that's kind of a conflict in a way between the president and the Democratic Party and certain elements of the population that don't want a wall. There's certain elements of the population that do support the president. So it's been, this whole month has been kind of about the relationship of the presidency to the rest of the population. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about in regard to this new moon at 15 degrees, where if you look, the Saturn is at 14 degrees 48 minutes, so it's a trine, making a trine. So it means that it's kind of a positive outcome in a way. You know, there's definitely a change in the way this is coming for the president. There's a change in that whole situation, but it could be positive. You know, there's ways that it's going forward, maybe in a peaceful resolution, one would hope. So, and then also Eris has been on the U.S. Chiron ever since the invasion of Iraq, and even before that, 2003. So I think it's been an angst-ridden time, I think, for overseas intervention and the public's general concern about where the country is going and what's happening with people around the world and how that relates to the United States position. You know, I think that's, but I don't want to get too much into politics, actually, to tell you the truth. So maybe I'll just leave it at that.
Can we do one more question?
And we'll do one more question.
Because I forgot about it and I want to include it.
That's okay. Let's include one more question.
Okay. It's from Julie, who's here with us. Why or how are people more sensitive than others to the moon's energies, especially full moons?
Well, that's a good point. Yeah, the moon and the sun, if you think about it, they represent something very profound, which is the solar light of day and the reasoning that goes with it. You know, you have logical, brilliant reasoning. They call it Apollonian thought, you know, like Apollo. Versus the moon, which is mystical and the light also of the night. But, you know, you have the sun rules the day, the moon rules the night. You've got the light and the darkness, you know, the two sides of our existence. And they're very fundamental in astrological thought. And you might wonder, in fact, why it is that even though the sun is 93 million miles away, the moon is much closer to the Earth, obviously, 240,000 miles away, why it is that the sun and the moon, by their distance and by their size, have exactly the same size disk. When the moon comes right in front of the sun, as we know in an eclipse, all you can see is the sun's corona, the atmosphere of the sun around it, which makes that diamond body, which is so fascinating to see the dark sun with the diamond surrounding it, the light of the corona surrounding it. It's beautiful. And how do we have it like that? Why are the sun and moon the same size disk? This is something that astrology has an explanation for, because we talk about the lights, we talk about the sun and the moon. The sun rules the day, the moon rules the night. The moon is a mystical light that changes and is feminine in origin, really. Maybe the changing face of the moon reminds us of the changing moods and of emotions, like more feminine in a certain way. And the 28-day cycle of a woman's cycle is, of course, the same as the cycle of the moon, the entire time of the moon's revolution. And then the sun is associated with male. So, I mean, you know, we do have this very fundamental distinction between them. And as I say, they're the same size disk, which astrology has an explanation for, but science does not. Actually, the physical science of the bodies would regard that as well, that's a complete coincidence. And so I think it's very interesting that we do have this astrologically geared fundamental cycle of 30 days, you know, which is that time that the sun and moon come back together in the new moon, and it's just the rhythm of our lives, divided into weeks. You know, we have our weeks that we consider like the timing of things, and the weekend that comes, and then another week that comes, the quarters of that phase. pretty much. I mean, it's not exact, but so it's just a fundamental cycle that we have, and it's part of the understanding that we have that astrology matters, and that somehow we're in this magical universe that is speaking to us through the positions of the sun and moon and the planets and the stars. So, welcome to cosmic reality. So let me switch back. Just to say, I enjoyed sharing this time with you. I hope you enjoyed it. It is wonderful to lift our gaze from just the day-to-day and the schedules and the timing of things and just making a living and making our house and giving ourselves shelter and making babies and seeing them grow up, are all the things we have on this earthly existence, and lifting our gaze to the cosmic realities that are really part and parcel of that entire situation. And that's what astrology helps us do. It helps us tune in to what is beyond just the mundane affairs, to another way of looking at it. So thank you for your attention, and appreciate it, and see you in a couple of weeks. Okay, bye now.